Thanks for that. Yeah, I am a farmer. I have been involved in farming politics, and that's probably where I got a lot of my grounding in the climate science things. But just as a bit of background, I'm from the US. I was a computer consultant and quantitative analyst there. My degree's in computer science and psychology, which seems like an odd combination, but if you're actually trying to figure out how to write programs that people can use, having an understanding of psychology is actually quite useful. Have been in New Zealand for 20 years now. The family purchased Castle Point Station in August of 1998, and we emigrated in October. I've done a number of things, but probably the ones that are most relevant here in terms of off-farm activities on the Federated Farmers National Board for a number of years, and was the climate change spokesman from 2014 to 2017. I still chair the Fertilizer Quality Council and also a trustee on the Ag Recovery Foundation. And one of the interesting things there is we started dealing with high cane containers several years ago, and I can see where some of the nervousness is because it's a really nasty chemical. It does a really good job for what it's supposed to do, but I can see where there may be some issues long term. For some background on Castle Point Station, we are right on the coast, and 3/4 of our income comes from sheep, 1/4 from cattle. We've got 200 hectares of forestry. 130 of that is one big plantation, and the balance 70 are sort of smaller woodlots. We've got about 300 hectares of cultivatable ground, so that's our most flexible ones. Also have a separate holiday park and motel operation, so we are involved in tourism. And yeah, I do get a bit distressed at New Zealand saying tourism is the future. I run both types of businesses. I know which one I'd rather be in. For the economy, tourism, it's a minimum wage job, and it doesn't actually generate a hell of a lot of revenue. Look at the infrastructure we've got involved in that versus what's on the farm. The farm generates a lot more income, and our workers there are paid much higher wages. So as a future for tourism, unless we're going to change how we do it, yeah, it's a nice to have, but wouldn't be my first choice. In terms of how we're structured, we're a family-owned company. We use an advisory board for strategic directions and a management team for the day-to-day operations. We've got 5 full-time staff on the farm and then use outside contractors. And on the holiday park, we've got a couple that manage that. And again, they use casual for the peak periods. So moving on to what farmers are doing to mitigate climate change, I'm not sure they necessarily get a whole lot of recognition for what they are doing. And I think actually some of that may go back to the Kyoto Protocol, where if you were doing something, that didn't count. It's what you had to change that actually counted. So I think that's actually sort of clouded some of the thinking. Basically, farmers, like everybody else in New Zealand, are trying to look for ways of using power more efficiently, more fuel-efficient vehicles, tractors, that sort of thing. So that's a pretty standard thing across the board. Production efficiency is one of the huge gains that's getting made by farmers in New Zealand. You look at what the sheep industry's done, where we're producing 8% less product from half the number of sheep. It's a huge gain in efficiency. Unfortunately, from the climate change point of view, because it's based on production, we actually don't get too much credit for that increased efficiency. And that efficiency is really an intensity issue, and we've got less emissions per kilo of product. And that's where one of the debates that was talked about earlier in the first session is, if we can produce it more efficiently here, should we be doing it, or should we cap that production and have it go elsewhere where they might do it less efficiently? Another area that has led to that production efficiency is novel forages, and that is looking at various different things. New Zealand's pastoral systems are all built around ryegrass and white clover. It's a great system, but it's not necessarily the most productive. And so farmers are looking at all sorts of different forages. Lucerne, something that was used in the past. There were lots of issues with weeds and pests. Went out of favor. More recently, it's coming back into favor and getting planted around. Probably one of the more recent ones is the plantains. And it was very interesting talking to our helicopter pilot. He said, you know, a few years ago, I was getting paid to spray this stuff out. Now people are asking me to spread it all over their farm. What's going on? And I think one of the things with plantain in particular, its biggest gain is not so much the plantain plant itself, it's the fact that in companion planting it with other legumes like clovers, it's actually very, very clover friendly. And it actually allows us to get the legume content up, which gets higher nutrition, which means you're growing the animals faster, which makes them more efficient. And so that's where you're getting those gains. Fair bit of carbon sequestration going on. There's, in terms of forestry, that's the obvious one. The other one that gets a bit more controversial is what's happening in the soils. And you hear a lot about what can be accomplished in the soils. Unfortunately, most of that comes from Australia, which has extremely ancient and weathered soils and not a whole lot of organic matter, or places like the States where they've absolutely thrashed their soils and driven the organic matter out. New Zealand's got very young soils that have a lot of organic matter in them already. And from the work that's done in New Zealand, they're getting sort of mixed results. Some people are showing positives, some are showing negatives. Certainly in hill country, there's probably the biggest gains to be made versus in cropping grounds. New Zealand farmers are actually participating in the ETS in terms of forestry. Castle Point Station has been for a number of years with some sort of mixed results, which I'll touch on later. The other thing that's happening, and fairly rapidly in the last couple of years, is you are seeing changing attitudes. And I think that Nielsen report touched on that. Number of years ago, farmers were really very resistant to the whole concept. And now they're beginning to engage and discuss it. And they're beginning to grapple with it. So I think that's a quite positive thing. The other thing is they're actually, you know, they're looking around for solutions. There aren't a whole lot there that are readily apparent, so they may not be doing much, but they are actually looking for them, and they're considering the options. The other thing in terms of looking for solutions, there's some on-farm research that's going on, so that's another thing that you know, farmers are actually participating with the scientists and trying to find things that actually work on farm. And I think that's quite critical in the science field. If it's just done in the labs or only on research farms, farmers are quite skeptical as how they're going to be able to apply it. If you can actually do field work out on farms in a commercial basis, it's a lot harder to do the research, but this research can be much more readily picked up. One of the other things that happens when you do on-farm research is rather than just having the researcher and some of their technicians and stuff knowing about it and having it published in a paper, which if it's a high impact journal, probably no farmer's ever going to read it. If it's done in most of the on-farm research it's done has a community group wrapped around it. So all of a sudden you get a whole group of interested people and they actually go out and discuss it. And as you're working your way through the trial, when they're at dinner parties or barbecues or whatever, you know, they actually talk it. So when the research gets done, it's actually got a receptive audience right there to begin with, which is quite helpful. So coming back to trees on farms, which is probably a very important place to look. I was involved in a workshop that was looking at climate change issues, and one of the workshops was on forestry, and the foresters there said, well, if we're going to do more forestry, we want flat land next to a port. Well, there isn't any of that. So quite likely you're not going to see any more production forest, big production forest go in. So where are we going to do that? It's probably going to be on farms. Now, a lot of farms do have areas that can be planted out quite effectively. At Castle Point, we break down trees for the farm into basically for erosion control, shelter for stock, or amenity value. That's just when we're planting. We do a lot of spaced poplar pole planting, about 1,000 to 1,500 poles a year. We are actually form pruning them so that we can actually use, I'm hoping to have a butt log, so in 30 to 40 years when those trees are mature and threatening to fall over or drop limbs on people, that we can actually pull that out and use it for timber. In the States, I used to work for an architectural millwork firm. All our cabinet carcasses were made with poplar. So poplar is a very widely used wood, but I think in New Zealand we've been so focused on Pinus radiata that there really hasn't a market developed, although I am hearing very positive stories about farmers who are actually cutting poplars and using it for their own use or selling it commercially. Carbon sequestration is the other side, so if you're in the ETS, you're planting trees for that. Trees also provide good income diversification. When it comes time to harvest the forest, it's a big injection of cash. I think one of the things that gets missed sometimes about looking at the numbers, and they talk about what the average return per hectare over the lifetime of the forest. Yeah, it's a great return, but you only get that at the end. You don't get cash flow through, which makes it a lot more difficult. But it does provide for retirement, succession, that sort of thing. We've got 200 hectares now. We're actually looking at possibly planting another 300 hectares there. And some of the reasoning is for long-term planning and having an asset that is quite distinct from the farming operation. And you can basically got a lot of flexibility, whether you harvest it yourself, whether you sell the cutting rights. There are lots of different ways of doing it. And I think traditionally forestry has really been what we do with the land that isn't fit for livestock. I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but it's probably been the way most farmers view it. I think that's beginning to change. If you see, and I think as people have more discussion about forestry and realize what it actually can do, and I think especially as we consider other species other than Pinus radiata, there's some other species that are actually much higher value. And for instance, until recently, when you were planting natives, you weren't allowed to harvest them. And so that was a bit of a change because the natives are actually extremely high value. So just a farmer's view on the ETS. Yeah, they're confused. Quite possibly they're more downside than upside. And the way it's currently structured, it's not conducive to changing behavior. Now, confusing, we got into it very early on. We actually purchased the neighboring farm with the thought that we could plant it. We got somebody from MPI out, and he looked and said, yep, this would be no problem. About 3 months after we signed the mortgage, the rules started changing. And these days, out of a 730 hectare block, there's probably about 400 hectares we're not quite sure what we're allowed to do with. So when policy flip-flops, it can make it quite difficult. To be fair, it's sort of settled down now, and some of the changes that are being proposed are actually quite beneficial. In terms of the downside and upside, I was asked a while ago to speak on sort of climate change and intergenerational issues. And you look at the ETS as it has been structured, how unfair is it intergenerationally that this generation collects the carbon credits and potentially sells them. Next generation has to pay them back. What's it going to cost them to pay them back? It's an open check. It's pretty scary. So I think there you probably have a lot of people who are in the ETS, but they're actually not trading in it just because there's that open-ended liability. And in terms of the way that it's currently structured, it's basically just a tax on production. If you're going to actually collect it at the processor level, then you can do all sorts of wonderful things and you still pay the same. Whereas somebody down the road who does absolutely nothing, he gets charged the same. So until you're actually doing it on farm, and I realize it's extremely difficult to do, unless you actually can get the benefit from what you're doing, there's no incentive. So it's not a particularly good instrument for agriculture. But some of the things like bringing in averaging, where basically you can, when you plant a forest, instead of doing the sawtooth they do now, if you collect credits, harvest it, drops off, then you start doing it again, they'll basically average it out over time, meaning that once you put land into forestry, as long as it stays there, you basically collect the carbon credits through the first rotation, and then unless you change land use and go out of it, you don't have to pay them back. So that deals with that open-ended liability, and I think that will be actually quite beneficial and will probably get a lot more people interested in it. In terms of future directions and what are farmers looking at, again, new forages, feeds, and supplements. So the forages are reasonably easy in terms of how you deal with it. Some of the things around supplements, they work well in the dairy industry, where the cows are actually coming in and getting fed regularly. In an extensive sheep and beef operation where you may not even see the cows for a long time, how do you actually deal with that? So I think it's where different tools will suit different parts of the industry and different farming systems. And again, that's where there aren't any silver bullets. It's just going to be getting a whole lot of BBs we can sort of keep shooting away at. Technology in terms of inhibitors is quite interesting, but we've already seen with the likes of DCD the problems of rushing headlong into a technology without really thinking it through in a bigger picture. And so, inhibitors either in the rumen or in the soils certainly have a lot of potential. We need to make sure that we actually look through the whole thing. Stable political policy is going to be absolutely vital. Farmers work in very long cycles. They don't work in just an annual thing. So having a policy that gets changed every time there's a change in government is not particularly helpful. New products, that's an area where either a change in land use to go into a totally different type of product or different uses for existing things is always something worth exploring. And there are people doing it. New Zealand, I was actually asked the question by somebody at Motu, where do farmers get new ideas? And I thought about it, and a lot of them are actually from farmers traveling overseas, seeing something and saying, oh, that's a really cool idea. I think I can do that at home. We don't really have a system that actually is doing that in sort of any systematic way. So potentially that's an area that could be looked at. And I think another one that is absolutely critical is actually getting better marketing for New Zealand products. By that I mean for most of our pastoral products, and especially in the realms of meat, stuff goes offshore and just goes to a distributor. It's just an SKU on their list and they could care less about it. There is no ability to actually tell a story to the consumer. And we've got to change that. And there's some really interesting small companies in New Zealand that are doing it. But the big boys have a whole lot of stainless steel. They got to keep going. And it's not conducive to sort of taking risks on new ways of doing things. So I think that's another approach. I think, probably in conclusion, where there's been a lot of confusion, I think a lot of it actually has laid at the way the Kyoto Protocol was done and New Zealand's approach to that. I think the all sectors, all gases rolls off the tongue really nicely, but I think it's actually done New Zealand a huge disservice because by trying to treat everything the same, you think the same things apply everywhere. And it's only been in the last few years where they're beginning to talk about separate gases. They do need to be treated separately. They will have different solutions. And now that conversation is starting, you're actually getting some traction. Where I think a lot of farmers, carbon dioxide is a problem. We're going to stop using fossil fuels. Well, with biological emissions, we're not going to get that to zero. Biological systems are always going to have some sort of emissions. They say, well, if you're taking everything to zero, that's not going to happen. So they completely disengaged. Why bother beating your head against a wall, something you can't do? When you start saying, okay, we're going to treat methane differently, then that's great. Probably the little thing sitting in the background that's a bit tough is methane and nitrous oxide are actually going to be pretty closely linked. Methane may dissipate quickly, but nitrous oxide is not the same. And haven't been hearing a whole lot of conversation about that. I think that's going to be another area that needs a fair bit of work. But it's a new day dawning. It's sunrise at Castle Point. Thank you.